Today, I'm really pleased to go deeper in something that I consider a very interesting approach. Today, we'll discuss with Brian Ryan. Brian is the VP of Innovation at National Grid Partners. I'm saying that I was really impressed, and I really mean it, because National Grid decided to make quite an entry in the, let's call it, open innovation arena. And so in just less than 3 years ago, in 2018, they set up a new company called National Grid Partners to do what might be defined as sort of one-stop shop of everything that you need for innovation. And they decided to park this new entity in Silicon Valley. And so I think will be a very interesting discussion to go deeper into the model, to go deeper into the reason that I brought to such a decision and how the National Grid Partner is currently operating. So first of all, welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Alberto. It's lovely to be here.
So Brian, I think might be good to start to provide a couple of data points about National Grid to help our audience to understand who National Grid is, what they're doing.
Yeah, so National Grid operates in the UK. They own and operate the gas and electricity transmission system. They also have systems operations under their control. And in the Northeast, in Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island, we own and operate gas and electric transmission and distribution networks. So it's listed on both the New York Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange. We have about 23,000 employees across those two locations in the Northeast and in the UK. National Grid Partners, best way to describe it, Alberto, is think of us as being the innovation and investment arm for National Grid Group. So we cover there's five groups under National Grid Partners, two of which are in the investing side of things. One group invests in seed and early stage companies, so we call that team the Incubation team. The second part of the investment group is the CVC, and that's your later stage investments. So in both of those groups, we have a $300 million fund that we invest in startups. So far, in a relatively short period of time, we've invested in 27 startups and already had 2 exits. So wow. That team is going pretty well by any measure. The other 3 groups, we have a business development team, and they really are the interface between our investors, the portfolio companies that we invest in, and National Grid businesses. The 4th group is culture acceleration, and their role is really bringing the outside in. So we do things like sprints, we will do immersions, we will bring people from the business out to Silicon Valley, and we will introduce them and show them what it's like to be at the center of innovation and what it feels like to be in some of these bigger companies that are very innovative just by their nature. We also do venture rotations, so we get people from the core business to come and spend a couple of years with us rotating through the different teams, and then they go back into the business. So there's a lot of effort being put in there. And the final piece is the innovation team, which is the team that I have the privilege to lead. And we do 3 things. First of all, we report on all of the innovation activities across National Grid Group. And that team was set up to answer 3 pretty simple questions. How much money are we investing in innovation? Where are we investing it, topically and geographically? And how much value is that bringing to National Grid? And what impact is it having? So we produce a report twice per year and review that with our CEO and group executive. So that's a very important role for our team. The other two areas that we focus on is what I would best describe as growth and performance. Growth is about creating things that don't exist today, that if they did exist could have a significant impact on National Grid, its customers, and the environment. So essentially, using some sort of different words, you could think of that as being our group that spins out or spins up companies and projects. And the final piece of the puzzle from an innovation perspective is we look at what we call performance projects. And these are projects that are beyond the horizon of the existing innovation teams that are embedded in our core business. And for whatever reason, the existing sustaining innovation teams are not looking at technologies. We go beyond their horizon and try and drive performance for the core business through those activities. So that's NGP in a nutshell. It is very well rounded because it captures everything from seed, incubation, right the way through to fully implemented projects and spinning up and spinning out businesses.
No, again, as mentioned, I was really impressed when I heard about what National Grid was about to, and going back to 18, the fact that you decided to put together such a comprehensive mix of initiatives, and you decided to put it and locate it not in the UK, not on the East Coast, but in Silicon Valley. And the fact that this has been chosen Lisa Lambert with pretty strong reputation and experience from Intel Capital to lead the team, I think is, again, we are seeing multiple corporates from multiple industries approaching the open innovation. And I have to admit that what National Grid did probably has been the boldest move that I ever seen. And so that shows that there is a huge by high level, top level buy-in for such a move, because if not, probably a more cautious one step at a time approach may have been taken. And this situation has been probably a sort of Copernican revolution.
Yeah. Look, I think Lisa has incredible experience in the CVC space, has managed billion-dollar portfolios, and her investment team that she's hired all are Silicon Valley, veterans, and that is not just saying that. We can prove that through 27 investments in a very short period of time and 2 exits already in less than 2 years. So that it's hard to buy that type of experience, and having that depth of experience in the venture capital side of things has been immensely helpful. I think on the innovation side of things, my team has a mix of National Grid employees. Some of the team members have been at National Grid for 20 plus years, and some of the team members we've brought in from the outside. So I really work hard to get the balance right, because my team is split between here in Silicon Valley and the Northeast of the US and the UK. So we have a really great mix and a diverse mix of thinking, backgrounds, experience. And when you put all that into the pot, it's very complementary. So sometimes describe this as, the innovation in a box or a one-stop shop, whatever way you want to put it. The synergies that you really get from having an investment and an innovation team sitting next to each other shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah, let's focus a bit on your team. That actually, you call it innovation. Probably another way to call it, using the terminology that at least in this new open innovation arena has been used, is probably the definition of defining it alternative might be venture builder, in a way that you have a team that is supposed to, among the other things, also to launch new future business for National Grid. And it's very, very interesting topic, the venture builder, because probably if you ask me today, what is in the open innovation area, the most hottest trend that we see is venture builder. I see a lot of corporate that have just announced venture builder, just launched venture builder. They're about to launch venture builder. They are considering the option. And so probably your experience, that is a good 2 years, that for this instrument is quite a long experience. And I think might be interesting also to go a bit more into details in terms of how specifically do you operate. One thing that I'm very, very interested, you already mentioned, but also to understand also your team, the profile of your team. You see as a mix of people with a strong grip on the business, on the technology of National Grid, but also people with an external entrepreneurial perspective. How large is your team? What is the composition? What the profile of the people that you bring on board to complement the internal industry expertise? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think on the innovation side, one of the key things that we did when we started this group was really defining what innovation is. As we all know, it's an overused buzzword, and often not very well defined. And that's okay. But what's not okay is not to define it. It's really important to get people in the business to understand what you mean by innovation and define it in a way that is useful for the business and also resonates with people in the business. So we split out the terminologies pretty clearly early on around sustaining innovation. And the sustaining innovation are the innovation teams that sit inside in the business units. A lot of time they're focusing on Horizon 1 type activities, if I think of it from a Steve Lang Horizon perspective. We had very little activities that were shareholder funded in Horizon 2 or Horizon 3. And that's where our team was set up to really focus on. So the first key learning, I would say, is get in and define what you're going to do, and then build your measures of what success looks like based on that definition. The second thing I learned when I came into National Grid, and I've learned this through other companies, is corporate innovation. There are some pitfalls that people can fall into. And two big ones that I've seen over my time is the innovation theater. So just doing something to make yourself look good, wonderful, without really any business impact tied to that. So we avoid that like the plague. And the second one is really understanding, not getting carried away on a technology and then trying to find a problem for it to solve. I saw this at many companies when blockchain first kind of hit the ground, and everybody got excited about the technology and spent a lot of time and resources looking for a problem for it to solve. We take the completely opposite approach. Albert Einstein once said that if I had 60 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes identifying the problem and 5 minutes looking for a solution. So once you are very precise and concise about the problem that you're trying to solve, it becomes incredibly easy to find a technology to solve that problem. So, putting the horse before the cart is really important in the innovation space. So when I think about our team then, the problems that we are solving are not just National Grid problems, because utilities all around the world face similar problems. How do you ingest the data that has been built up over decades? How can you monetize that? How can you, and I mean monetize it in a way of not just making money, but saving money and reducing bills for customers. So, utilities struggle with these aging assets. how do you maintain 60, 70-year-old assets? How do you upskill the workforce to be able to maintain this diverse level of assets? How do you then apply newer technologies in terms of wearable technologies, artificial intelligence to keep people safe? So the beautiful thing about our group is the problems that we're identifying and opportunities for National Grid. We can see that they are similar problems across the entire industry. So they do immediately have the ability to scale up. Our team then, so that having people with experience at National Grid and deep relationships in National Grid has been really helpful, but also bringing in fresh perspectives from the outside with people that have come from consultancy firms, they've been entrepreneurs themselves, come from just very different industries, even financial backgrounds. So you need all of these things to be successful in the innovation space. It is very much a multifaceted team approach required to be really successful. So, an entrepreneur on their own is very rarely successful unless they have somebody that's good from a finance perspective, from a technology perspective. You can't really expect one person to be able to cover all the disciplines that you need to be successful.
How many people are in your innovation team?
There's 17 people in
17.
the team.
And out of the 17, how many are, let's say, industry, National Grid expert, and how many have this fresh, different perspective?
Yeah, it's almost half and half.
50-50, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good, interesting point, and this is something, by the way, that we also see in other experiences, like for example, Launchpad by BP. Similar team composition, because they recognize that they need both components, industry expertise and as well as this external perspective that typically is needed to be complemented. And so another typical factor that we see talking about this new venture builder concept is you are called up to build a potentially new business. And the typical key decision is how many of them are you working on? And typically one of the criteria that in a certain way create a sort of differentiation between the old-fashioned accelerators and this new venture builders concept is the old-fashioned accelerators was you apply a sort of spray and pray approach.
Yeah.
You try multiple bets at the same time. Actually, you're not even pursuing them directly, let them go, and then you try to pick up something that might come at use. But in this situation, what we see at least, but I wanted to check with you if is also the NGP case, is to have definitely a more focused approach on a few number of projects at a time. So because if not, you spread your bets too much, and you also spread your resources. And so what's your approach here?
Yeah, so I'd say there's two approaches. On the investment side, 80% of the investments we make must be strategic. And there's a definition around strategic and a measure around strategic. So it's not this loose vision of, oh yeah, of course it's because it's far out there, therefore it's strategic. There's none of that. It's very clear what our conditions are to meet strategic. So 80% of the investments we've made so far meet that definition, and that's the threshold for us. But that also allows us to have a targeted portfolio then, or that other 20% to allow for more pathfinding types of deals. So giving us access to early stage initiatives that are closer to Horizon 3 type projects. On the innovation side, we spent a lot of time on metrics and measures and understanding the priority areas. So we spend on performance type initiatives, working with all of our business units, clearly defining what the problem is. What is it big enough and worth solving? Once we get the top priority areas, then we will go and find solutions to solve those problems. So it's very simple, actually. I think a lot of companies overcook how you should be measuring innovation activity. And it's by impact. We look at it by impact, and that includes financial and non-financial measures. So, even the non-financial measures in terms of emissions, you can still measure those. So it takes a little bit of extra brain power and effort to actually sit down and think about how are you going to measure the effectiveness of the group. And then we also look at how do you measure the efficiency of the group. So we think about the pipeline. And often people think, fail early. Yeah, that's great. But we don't let stuff into the pipeline. We have a big pipeline at the top, as you would expect. And we have a hit rate there of maybe 2 out of 100. But then when they actually go into it, we have a very simple two-stage or two-step stage gate process. Once you get into that process, the hit rate, success rate is about 80%. So 8 out of 10 projects will make it through, but only 2 out of 100 will make it in. So we are very clear about and precise about what makes it through and why it makes it through, and measuring the impact.
So you were mentioning that you have these two-step processes. So you start from a broad pipeline, a broad deal flow, potentially interesting innovation projects, and at a certain point you are able to quickly reiterate them to identify the 2 out of 100 that you really want to focus on. Yeah. And then let's say that enter in the second level of the innovation process, when you go to the venture building, and you say that in this situation the hit rate is typically higher because a certain point has been carefully selected, and then you focus on scaling them up. Quick question about the selection process. How long does it take? Is it recurring? How does it work?
Yeah, so we have a process, and it can happen at any time. So we don't wait for something to happen every quarter.
Yes, there are no batches.
Often, yeah, opportunities pop up at 2 o'clock in the morning. They don't wait until it's the next quarter. So often I will get texts or calls or emails from my team saying, what about this? What about this? So we have a relatively unstructured way of capturing the early stage in the pipeline. All of those initiatives, we do log them in our database so we can track them and understand, extract any learnings from them. Why did we not do this? Why did we do this one? So that the early stage is a little bit more unstructured. As you get to the later stage, we have a stage gate process, and we call the first meeting the concept meeting, and the next meeting is kind of the approval for scale-up meeting. So at the concept level, I look for 3 key things. What is the problem you're solving? What's the and therefore the impact that you can have? How does your solution actually address that particular problem? And then how do you monetize it? So they're the 3 key elements of our first phase.
And how many? So there are substantially a concept meeting. You pass through the concept meeting. I expect that just a few of them are able to pass through the next stage, that is the scale-up meeting, right?
Yeah, it's a lot hard. The first meeting is relatively easy to get past. The second meeting is a lot harder. So the time from the concept meeting to the approval meeting can be up to a year.
1 year, okay.
Yeah.
And how many projects are you following up in parallel between the concept meeting and the approval?
So I would say that I'll answer that in 2 ways, Alberto. There's across NationalGrid, there's over 400 initiatives that meet the definition of innovation. And that's the entire pipe. So that's what's in the pipeline and what's live. So they all look at it, they're all on different technology readiness levels. Some of them you could look at how they fit into different horizons, if I think about a Steve Blank horizon framework. And then some of those are with different readiness levels in terms of, is it a pilot or is it ready to roll out? From our team, we would have a handful of projects. As you could imagine, half of our team is focused on growth and half is on performance. So we only have a handful of people. So we would have at any particular time a handful of projects in between that concept meeting and approval meeting running.
Okay, got it. And then when they pass the approval meeting, they enter in the scale-up phase. That is the real venture building phase. Again, you have cleared up the concept, and now you start a race to scale them up as fast as possible. And what's the process there? How do you work with this project in order to bring them to the next phase, that is being a business to be launched, I expect?
Yeah, so there's two ways that are two ways that we look at this. One is projects that are going to be taken on by the business. Mm-hmm. So do we have an owner in any of the National Grid business units that are saying, I want this, I need this, I want to take it? So we create an environment, excuse me, we create an environment where the business is saying, I love this project so much, please give it to me. As opposed to sometimes we see in innovation projects where the project gets kind of thrown over the fence and the poor business is left to fend for themselves. Yeah. So we work really hard on creating a compelling reason for the business that they understand that this is going to bring benefits to them. And we have handover documentation and agreements on what, when that finishes and what good looks like. So that's one type of scale up. It scales up inside in our National Grid businesses.
But you are driving the scale up phase, or you hand over immediately after the approval meeting?
We would work with the business unit.
You work together. Okay.
Yeah. Once you kind of get into a regulated business and big businesses, there are so many other areas that we may not have considered from a risk perspective, for example. We do obviously consider cybersecurity, but the team, the National Grid business would go to an extra level of due diligence to understand, can this connect to our control center? We're now, when you're starting to scale up some of these projects in a live business, the risk profile increases. Therefore, you need to kind of consider all of the variables that, and some of those we may not have considered in the early stages.
Yeah. And so
then on the scaling up, we also scale up. We have the ability to scale up teams ourselves. And sometimes we work with accelerators or incubators and see if our technology could be adopted by a company that is already in existence today, and we can monetize that. So we try and stitch together the technologies that are out there in the world that exist today to solve a problem that nobody else is solving. So it's almost like a matchmaking scenario.
So it's essentially you have two potential outcomes. One is the handover to the business unit.
Yeah.
And so you work together with the business unit to bring them to a point where you can leave it in their hands. On the other hand, you work to package it for the market, and you can have multiple potential outcomes. So maybe you can spin off a company, you can work with four parties, you potentially might also at a certain point to sell it because it's become an independent company. And there is a question here is in terms of capital. Again, you are a team, half of your people is focused on this scaling phase. And then typically scaling phase require also capital allocation, because if you want to scale up something, money is something that it might be needed. And the capital allocation comes from your team or come from somewhere else?
Yeah, so we have two sources of capital. One is shareholder funding, and that's what we would use for spinning up businesses. And the other source of funding comes from our regulated businesses. So any project that we work where we've consumed regulated capital, the benefits of those projects must flow back to the source of the funding. So, for example, if we did a project in the UK that had regulatory funding through our UK business, whatever benefits and impact we accrue through the project must go back to the UK business, and then that will flow on to the customers in the UK.
Okay. So substantially, the budget for scaling up the initiative might either come from the shareholder funding or from the regulated business. And at a certain point, you negotiate the budget for each of these projects, or you have a sort of allocation that you can draw in as needed?
Yeah, we just do a yearly plan, so like a budgeting process.
Okay. Based on the initiative that are currently in your hands, you get the allocation. Sort of an evergreen concept, yes.
Exactly. And the CVC side of things is different.
Yes.
That's a longer term commitment. But on the innovation side, it's generally year to year.
Good, because this is another typical question, because this is the old discussion about evergreen versus closed fund concept. The evergreen, every year you are in a sort of negotiation to get the capital allocation, and again, it's on the one hand is more flexible, on the other you never know how much you can get, and that might be in a certain way also sometimes impacted by some specific condition. Why, if you go in a closed fund scenario, you definitely have more stability because you know what has been allocated to you, and it's not an ongoing discussion. It's just that you work with what you have. So that was my question.
We have a baseline that we need to operate. I love the idea of zero-based budgeting, where we've got to earn whatever capital we receive. So every year we need to look in the mirror and go, how much impact did we have last year? And do we deserve the same amount of capital allocation next year? And we need to be pretty brutal with ourselves when we answer that question. So I like the idea of having no money and always having to look for it. The beautiful thing about that is we've never been refused funding. So if your idea is good enough, you will be able to find capital in a company of this size. So I never worry about capital allocations.
Yes, typically if you have good stuff in your hands, you're typically always able to find the money. This is what I would say is the general principle, but decline in the old-fashioned corporate politics and words, that you might find sometimes not actually happening, because again, reorganization, priorities, market conditions, that are situations that we have learned that might create an impact. So, but again, it's probably is still another indication that there has been behind this NGP project a strong top-level buy-in, because at the end, that is something that is continuing.
And I think there are stresses and strains on every business over the last 12 months in particular, be they growing pains for some companies that have done well out of a pandemic scenario, and shrinking pains of other companies. We have to be extremely respectful of any of those challenges that are being put on the business. And we've got to understand them deeply and respect it. And in some scenarios, some of our colleagues in the regulated business don't stay around, or there might be cutbacks in different parts of our business. So that's why I feel better about justifying our existence as opposed to being given a budget that you say, go ahead and play. I think we've got to be incredibly respectful to all of our colleagues across National Grid and demonstrate that we are adding value.
Yes, that's a very, very good point, and but I think it is difficult to be implemented because again, you are not, and that's trigger my next question again, because I was just saying it's difficult to prove the value that you're generating if you are investing into the future, because again, typically it's easier to show the value that you're producing if your goal is to servicing H1, while if you're servicing H3, it's difficult to show how much value you're producing because you will produce something valuable probably down the way, not immediately. So, and that triggers my next question is, that is quite a big question. So I'm not expecting you to give me a full answer, but I'd like to get your thoughts about that. Is how do you measure the impact of your activities, particularly looking at activities that are a bit more not in the sustaining and not in the adjacent innovation, but the one that are a bit more farther. How do you measure that? Which KPIs are you using for? You already mentioned, but I'd like to focus on the H3, H2 activities.
Yeah, so the H2, as you go further out the horizons, as you know, it becomes less obvious, the connection to your existing business. And it also becomes less obvious how you measure this thing. And it also increases the risk profile. You know, ink never refuses, or paper never refuses ink, and Excel never refuses somebody typing in some numbers. So we can all generate a beautiful hockey stick of growth that is, you know, 10 years out. And we all know what happens to those hockey sticks. In most cases, they don't come true.
You just remain with the stick. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. You just end up at the bottom bit all the time. So Horizon 2 activities are really easy to measure from my perspective. And I look at it in using the word impact. So we have financial and non-financial. So financial, at a regulated business like ours, there's many different financial mechanisms you can pull. You can pull incentives, you can pull performance activities. You can also reduce costs by doing less maintenance or doing less installation of equipment. So you can have a volume driver. So there's 7 different seven different levers in our UK business that we can measure against the impact of the project. The non-financial measures, obviously we can look at it from a safety perspective. So, but we have to be very precise on what we call those out. So we work with the risk team and go, what are the risks that you're seeing here? Does this reduce the risk for this particular activity? So again, you can measure those things. So Horizon 2 I found pretty easy to measure. Horizon 3 is a little bit of crystal ball gazing, but what, you know, and my crystal ball is probably just as good as yours or just as bad as yours. Portraying these in a portfolio manner for me makes sense. So you don't want to go to senior executives and give them just a pitch on Horizon 3 activities, because it may not really land. And not all of our activities are focused on Horizon 3. So we have a portfolio approach. So when you look at the portfolio of Horizon 2 and Horizon 3, then you get a little bit more grace. But the things we do look for, it's the same metrics and measures in Horizon 3 that we measure in Horizon 2, but with a higher level of uncertainty.
Yeah. No, that's important. And that is another big topic. And then this is mostly something that come up with my discussion with general partner of CBCs. And that is one of the big value that a CVC, but also an innovation unit like yours, is putting on the table is that you are helping the parent company to take their strategic long-term decisions, because again, you are a certain way, you're looking at the future, you are presenting potential strategic directions. So, and you're putting this as a service of the top management to understand what could be the next moves. And this is a typical activity that the CVCs and innovation unit venture builders do, but on the other hand, is even more difficult to measure because, again, yes, we are doing this, exposing your portfolio to the top managers, to the senior management. You are helping them to visualize some potential strategic direction. None of them will happen, none of them will be decided to be pursued, but the fact that they are exposed, there is some value. Is there any way that you guys are measuring this kind of exposure activities, or just informal exposure?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. So we measure what I would describe as the inputs, not necessarily the outcomes of these interactions. So how many interactions have we had with a business unit that we brought a new idea to them that they really liked and did something with? Okay, so you can measure that as an input, but it's very difficult to measure that as an impact or an outcome. We, in our culture program, we do immersions. We bring the executive team members out to Silicon Valley. That definitely has an impact, but how do you measure that is really, really difficult. So in these tricky ones, we measure the inputs and the tasks as opposed to the actual impact or outcome. So we do track how many interactions we have with all of our business units and how many new initiatives we've brought to them, how many they've embraced. Because there are companies that our investors see that we don't invest in, but our core business goes, oh, wow, that could really solve that particular problem for me. So those we would see as positive interactions. And we can see an impact, but we can't really measure it.
Yes, it's reasonable to me, but sometimes in a world where anything should need to be justified, it's good also to have MNO to show the value that you are producing. Because again, we have done multiple times to bring in senior executives to Silicon Valley, and the outcome has always been positive, extremely positive. Because again, just coming to San Francisco, the Valley, and visualizing what is happening I believe as a gigantic value to everybody. That's what has been my experience. But on the other hand, if you put yourself on the corporate perspective, this is activities that generate additional costs that in times when there are a bit more pressure on cost might be the first to be cut. Or particularly you are producing costs, but you are producing undefined value. And so that's why having some ideas how to justify such activities is important, because I think this is a common problem for many people. Working on culture is something that, or working with exposure is something that is for sure is producing value, but it's really difficult to be grasped, and probably the activities might be easily cut in times of need.
Yeah, I think a lot of the cultural stuff is about creating evangelists inside in our business.
Yes.
Some people come back or go back into their office after a week in Silicon Valley. They're brimming with enthusiasm, and it opens a lot of doors for us and creates evangelists for us inside in the business, and they communicate the good work that's been happening. The great thing with this group is that we give them the material to go beyond just the rhetoric of, I was in Silicon Valley and it was great. Here's 10 projects that have saved $1 billion for our business, or likely save $1 billion for our business over the next 10 years. That becomes very impactful. So we have a constant baseline of really tangible financial benefits that every aspect of our group is bringing. The CVC stuff is relatively straightforward. I think measures in the CVC world are well known. Measures in innovation are not as well known. So that's where we spend a lot of our time focusing on the impact. How much money is this going to save us over the next 20 20 years. So yeah, it's a mix, I would say, Alberto.
Yeah, it's a complicated mix, and but again, it's becoming a trend that I'm seeing is there is a more and more scrutiny on also these innovation activities. Also, because as you properly said before, one risk is to work in what you define the innovation theater. And so the innovation theater is exactly the opposite of that, is doing stuff for the sake of communicating, for the sake of doing stuff, and not for the sake of reducing an impact. But sometimes it's difficult to draw the line between the theater and the real value generation activities. And so that's why I was wondering if you guys got some KPIs that you can recommend.
Yeah, so we do. So, obviously the financial aspects, right? So, but that's pretty straightforward, and each business will have different financial drivers. On the non-financial, we look at what impact is it going to have on the environment, and again, that's pretty easy to measure. And what impact are you going to have on the community? That one is a little bit harder. So, how do you increase engagement in the community? They're really the three key metrics from an innovation perspective that I look for. I often call it the Holy Trinity. How do you make sure that you have a commercial, positive commercial outcome, a positive environmental outcome, and a positive societal or community outcome? And you can get projects that fit into each one of those three on their own, but with a little bit of extra intellectual horsepower and effort, you can find projects that fit right in the center of those. So we, as an example, we did a project for electric school buses for low to moderate income community in New York. And we are going to fund the difference of 25 electric buses for targeted schools in the LMI community. And we will fund the difference between the cost of buying a diesel bus and an electric bus. We will source those buses, so it overcomes a lot of barriers for the schools to actually acquire these types of buses. And over time, the schools and the buses will be able to participate in demand response, because we will get to a point at some stage where vehicle to grid is going to be important. And buses, school buses, are big batteries. So the school will now be able to make money on this, and that money goes back into the teachers' pockets. And we have numbers for all of those activities. So we have numbers on the environmental, the financial, and we can see the community benefits, but it's hard to quantify it. But at a high level, they're the three ones that we focus on.
Commercial, environmental, and societal. Yes, that makes sense. One of my last question is, you mentioned before that you have in the broader team people that are focused on business development, that are actually trying to probably working on what is called the venture client model, meaning trying to helping connection between startups and the different business unit. How do they work? How many of them?
Yeah. So their core function is to understand what are the problems that the core business is facing today. So Horizon 1 type initiatives. They will then package that up into use cases that the business development team will then hand over to our investors. And in that document, it makes it really clear what the problem is that we would like to solve as NationalGrid and what the impact of solving that would be. Based on those use cases, the investors then build out investment thesis for each one of our business units. Based on those investment thesis, the investors then go and find companies that we can invest in. And we have to do that work because we do want to hit that 80% strategic measure. So that's a big part of the business development role. They also do the reverse. So I've spoke, they're kind of the translation layer between investors and the business. Investors will often come across a company and they go, wow, this is incredible. I could see use for this in our regulated business, but I can't invest in it at the moment for whatever reason. So the business development team then would take that company and go back to their stakeholders and go, we found this company, what do you think? More often than not, the core business goes, yeah, I love it, this is great. But we don't really get a huge amount of value out of that, or any value from a CVC perspective in that interaction. In terms of size of the team, there's 5 people in that team. So, a lot of people think big corporate innovation has to have big numbers. I find that if you have small teams that are really focused and a lot of experience, you can achieve a lot more. We see it in a software development space where, an incredible software developer can write code 10 times faster than an average one. That's the sort of area that I think big corporates should be focusing on, is finding the best of the best and having an impact, rather than spreading, as you say earlier, spreading your bets so far and having huge innovation teams. So I think, we've demonstrated over the last 3 years that with a small group, you can have a significant impact even on a company the size of National Grid.
Final question about the business development team. So they currently, if I got it right, the goal is to have the relation with the business unit, identifying the challenges, the use cases they want to get solved, mostly in H1, close to the core strategic areas, and then they go back to the CVC in order to identify potential solution. This solution most of the time bring to an investment. So this solution becomes a portfolio company of National Grid partners. And sometimes there is also the other way around, that you identify some interesting companies that are not investment grade, might be interesting for a commercial partnership. I was thinking while you were describing your model to me, for example, to the model that Shell Venture is using. They have a group of people called implementation managers that have a similar goal, so meaning to act as a liaison between the CVC and the parent company and the business unit of the parent company. But there are also other specific goal is to foster business relationship between the portfolio company and the business unit of the parent company, because again, if not, sometimes the dialogue is complicated. So they need really people that push in order to make deals happen, to move from the pilot to a full scale deployment. Is the development doing a similar thing or not?
Yeah, so they do. If we invest in a company and it becomes a portfolio company, a key role for business development is introducing that portfolio company to the right people at National Grid. So not only can that company increase their sales with National Grid, but National Grid also gets a big benefit out of this team, or this portfolio company, I should say. So yeah, there is a lot of that type of activity, and we work really hard to make sure it's not push. It's not a sales job, because that can have the opposite effect if you're just pushing stuff on top of people. It's making sure, going back to tying it to the problem. Hey, Alberto, you told us last month that if we solve this problem, you'd be really happy. Here's 5 companies that can solve that for you, and they're all portfolio companies. So the portfolio company gets benefit and National Grid gets benefit. So that's a big chunk of their work.
Got it. Perfect. So to conclude this very interesting chat, I would like to ask you to provide some tips or some advice to your peers that are running a venture builder. And so if you have just to point out 2-3 recommendations that might help them to do better the job, something that you have learned during your own job, what they might be.
Yeah, so I can think of 3. 3 is always a nice number. One is define what innovation means for you and your business in a way that people understand. The second part, I would say, is focus on the problem, not the solution. So that old Albert Einstein quote comes to mind, and he was a pretty smart guy.
Yes,
and the final bit Yeah, the final thing that has helped me is incredibly disciplined and deliberate stakeholder management. So making sure that you're getting your story heard across the board and that people are evangelists for your group. So the communications aspect of the work that you're doing is almost as important as the work you're doing. Because you could, if you're doing fantastic work and nobody knows about it, you're not going to have the impact. So they'd be the top three that I've learned.
And talking about communication, what you specifically do, some practical tips to keep the communication channel open with your stakeholders? What is the typical way you do that?
So we have regular meetings that are already planned. We have Yammer groups. We have every week our company sends out updates on what's happening across the company. So we work very closely with our internal communications people to make sure our story is getting to the broadest audience possible. And then there's an external audience perspective as well.
Yeah.
But internally, we use our internal comms people a lot. I meet with the internal comms people every week.
Yes. Okay. So, Brian, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate your conversation. And since you are definitely doing a lot of things and you are evolving pretty fast, I think will definitely make sense to reschedule a conversation in a few months from now, also to understand the progress, understand what your learnings you have accrued, understand what new direction you are taking. But by now,
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You know what? Thank you, Alberto. It's been a great chat and always happy to connect and talk about any topic. This is a great area that is starting to take off finally. And what I'm really enjoying about this at the moment is that people are beginning to recognize that innovation can be a discipline, not just a place to dump, odd people, for want of a better term, into a different team, right? So.
Yes, I heard another good comment here is that finally there will be a time, probably sooner rather than later, where we no longer talk about innovation in companies, because all people will understand that they have to innovate, and so there are no longer innovation team. It would be everybody's job, and that's probably we need some time to get there, but probably we're in the right direction.
Yeah, superb.
My pleasure. Bye.
Take care. Have a good weekend.